At 14,000 feet over Bougainville on April 18, 1943, First Lieutenant Rex Barber pushed his P-38 Lightning into a dive and watched 4 Japanese Zeros turn to meet him. 23 years old, 72 combat missions, 0 dogfight victories against Zeros using regular tactics. The Japanese pilots knew what American pilots knew. The Zero could outturn anything in the sky. The P-38 Lightning, twin-engine, twin-boom, heavy interceptor had no business trying to dogfight the most maneuverable fighter aircraft in the world. 41 P-38s had been lost in the Solomon Islands since January, 27 shot down by Zeros in turning fights. The pattern was always the same. American pilot tries to turn with the Zero. Zero turns inside. Zero gets guns on target. American pilot dies, but Barber was not turning. The Zero pilots expected him to brake left or right, to commit to the horizontal fight where Japanese training and aircraft superiority would decide the outcome in seconds. Instead, Barber kept his Lightning in a vertical dive, accelerating past 350 miles per hour, then 400, then 420. The Zeros tried to follow. Their engines screamed at maximum power. Their airframes began to shake. At 430 miles per hour, the Zero pilots had to pull out. Their aircraft could not handle the speed. The airframe would fall apart. The controls would lock up. They had to choose between pulling out or dying. Barber kept diving. At 460 miles per hour, he pulled hard on the yoke. The Lightning's twin Allison engines roared. The airframe groaned but held. He came out of the dive 2,000 feet below the Zeros, accelerating away in level flight. The Japanese pilots could not catch him. By the time they had recovered from their stop dives, Barber had gained 3 miles of separation and climbed back to altitude on the other side of the combat area. He had survived a Zero fight by refusing to fight the way Zeros expected to be fought. If you want to see how American pilots discovered the P-38's hidden advantage and turned the tide in the Pacific Air War, hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe if you have not already. Back to Barber. What he just did broke every instinct trained into fighter pilots since World War I. You do not run from a fight. You do not dive away from an enemy. You turn, you climb, you maneuver, you get your guns on target. That is how air combat worked. That is how aces were made. Running away was cowardice. Except Barber had just survived an encounter that killed 2 other P-38 pilots that same morning. Second Lieutenant Julius Jacobson had tried to turn with a Zero at 8,000 feet over Empress Augusta Bay. The Zero had completed its turn in 4.2 seconds. Jacobson's P-38 needed 7.1 seconds for the same maneuver. The Japanese pilot had 3 seconds to line up his shot. Jacobson's Lightning had exploded in midair, hit by 20 military cannon shells through the cockpit and left engine. He was 20 years old, 83 hours of combat flying time. Dead because he had fought the way fighter pilots were supposed to fight. The Zero was purpose-built for dogfighting. Mitsubishi designed it around a single principle: turn faster than anything else. The A670 weighed 5,313 pounds empty. The P-38 Lightning weighed 12,800 pounds empty. The Zero had 1 engine producing 940 horsepower. The P-38 had 2 engines producing 1,150 horsepower each. But weight mattered more than power in turning fights. The Zero could hold a 5G turn at 230 miles per hour. The P-38 needed 290 miles per hour to maintain the same turn rate, and at that speed it generated less than 4 Gs. In any long turning fight, the Zero would complete 2 full circles before the P-38 finished 1.5. Japanese pilots used this advantage ruthlessly. They had learned the P-38's limitations in combat over New Guinea and the Solomons. When American fighters appeared, Zero pilots would start turning fights immediately. Pull hard, climb spiraling, force the Americans to turn. Once the fight went horizontal and circular, the outcome was decided. Zeros would get inside the American turning circle, line up deflection shots, fire their Type 99 20mm cannons. P-38s would try to fight back, would try to outturn their opponents, would fail, would die. 5th Air Force Headquarters in Brisbane tracked the statistics. January 1943, P-38 squadrons in the Solomon Islands flew 1,247 combat sorties. They reported contact with Zero fighters in 193 fights, claimed 41 kills, lost 27 P-38s to Zeros in air-to-air combat, a ratio of 1.5 to 1. Barely breaking even against an enemy that was supposed to be outmatched by American industrial might and pilot training. Major General George Kenney commanded 5th Air Force. He had requested P-38s specifically for the Pacific Theater. Twin-engine reliability over vast ocean distances, heavy armament, 4 50 caliber machine guns, and 1 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose. No convergence problems like wing-mounted guns. Just point and shoot. Long range with drop tanks, the P-38 could fly 1,300 miles. No other American fighter could escort bombers deep into Japanese-held territory and return safely. But none of that mattered if P-38s kept dying in dogfights with Zeros. Kenney had pilots screaming at him, squadron commanders writing after-action reports demanding better aircraft, replacement pilots arriving from the States getting shot down on their 3rd mission, their 4th mission. Flight instructors in California were teaching dogfighting. Turn with your opponent, get inside his circle, fire when you have deflection. That worked in Europe against German fighters. Bf-109s and FW-1 fought like heavy fighters. Fast, powerful, deadly in boom and zoom attacks, but vulnerable in long turns. American pilots could outturn them if they had altitude and energy. Zeros were not German fighters. Zeros turned like nothing American pilots had ever seen. Japanese pilot training emphasized maneuvering combat. 6 months of formation flying, 3 months of aerobatics, 2 months of live fire gunnery, then combat deployment. Zero pilots could hold a 4G turn for 90 seconds without losing altitude. They could snap roll at 200 miles per hour and come out pointed at an enemy fighter. They could climb at 2,900 feet per minute from sea level to 10,000 feet. The United States Navy had learned this lesson in blood at Coral Sea and Midway. Navy fighters, F-4F Wildcats, could not turn with Zeros either, but Navy pilots had figured out the counter tactic. The Thatch Weave. 2 fighters working together, crossing paths repeatedly, never turning more than 90 degrees, always keeping speed above 250 miles per hour. When a Zero tried to turn with one Wildcat, the other Wildcat would have a shot at the Zero from the side. It worked. Kill ratios improved from 1:1 to 3:1 by August 1942. But the Thatch Weave required perfect coordination between 2 pilots who trusted each other completely and had practiced the maneuver hundreds of times. Army Air Force squadrons in the Pacific did not have that kind of unit teamwork. Replacement pilots arrived weekly. Veteran pilots rotated home after completing their tours. Squadrons never stayed together long enough to develop the teamwork the Thatch Weave required, and 5th Air Force doctrine emphasized individual initiative. Fighter pilots were supposed to be aggressive, independent, offensive-minded. The Thatch Weave felt defensive, passive, un-American. So P-38 pilots kept trying to dogfight Zeros, and they kept dying. Rex Barber had survived because he had refused to dogfight. But survival was not victory. Running away from Zeros did not win the air war. It just meant living to face them again tomorrow. What Barber needed was a way to use the P-38's advantages, whatever those were, to kill Zeros instead of just avoiding them. To understand how he found that advantage, you need to know where Barber came from. Culver, Oregon, population 342. Barber grew up on a cattle ranch, riding horses, fixing tractors, learning that survival on the high desert plateau meant working smarter than problems instead of harder. His father had taught him to think about leverage. A 140-pound man could not wrestle a 200-pound steer, but a 140-pound man with a rope and a fence post could control that steer perfectly. Find the advantage. Use the advantage. Win without fighting. Barber had joined the Army Air Corps in 1941. Flight training at Matherfield, California. Advanced training at Lukefeld, Arizona. He had graduated in the top 15% of his class, not because he was the most naturally talented pilot, but because he studied aircraft performance charts obsessively. He memorized power curves, climb rates, maximum speed at every altitude, fuel consumption at different power settings, structural limitations. While other pilots were drinking in Phoenix, Barber was reading technical manuals. He deployed to the Pacific in September 1942. 13th Air Force, 339th Fighter Squadron, based at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. His first combat mission was an escort flight for B-17 bombers hitting Japanese positions at WWII. No enemy contact. His second mission, October 14th, he had encountered Zeros for the first time. 3 P-38s against 7 Zeros at 12,000 feet. The Zeros had turned into them immediately. Barber had tried to turn with them. His flight leader, Captain Mitchell, had screamed over the radio to break off. "Dive away. Do not turn with them." Barber had hesitated 2 seconds. A Zero had gotten on his tail. 20mm shells had punched through his right boom. He dove away, trailing smoke. Barely made it back to Henderson Field. His P-38 required 8 days of repairs. Mitchell had torn into him on the flight line. "Never turn with a Zero. Never. You turn with them, you die." But what else was there? If you could not turn, how did you fight? Mitchell did not have an answer. Nobody did. So Barber started thinking about leverage. What did the P-38 do better than the Zero? He pulled the performance specifications for both aircraft. The Zero had a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour at 16,000 feet. The P-38 could reach 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, but combat did not happen at maximum speed. Combat happened at maneuvering speed, dogfighting speed, and at dogfighting speed, the Zero was nearly as fast as the P-38 in level flight, except in a dive. The Zero's maximum dive speed was 340 miles per hour. Push it faster and the controls locked up. The ailerons would not respond. The elevator became too heavy to move. Pilots reported airframe vibration starting at 360 miles per hour. At 380, the vibration became dangerous. Several Zeros had broken up in dives at speeds above 400 miles per hour. Japanese pilots knew their limits. They would not dive past 350 miles per hour under any circumstances. The P-38 could dive to 460 miles per hour safely. It could reach 480 in an emergency, though that stressed the airframe. That was a 110 miles per hour advantage in the vertical if you refused to turn. If you just dove whenever a Zero got close, the Zero could not follow. It could start the dive, but it had to pull out early or die. Barber tested this theory on November 3, 1942. Combat patrol over the slot. He spotted 3 Zeros at 11,000 feet. Instead of maneuvering for position, he dove from 15,000 feet, accelerated to 420 miles per hour, climbed back to 14,000 feet on the other side of the formation. The Zeros tried to pursue. They could not. Too slow in the dive. Too slow in the climb. He had escaped effortlessly, but escaping was not killing. How do you kill a Zero if you cannot turn with it? The answer came from another P-38 pilot, Captain Thomas Lanphier, 70th Fighter Squadron. Lanphier had been an engineering student at Stanford before the war. He understood energy states. An aircraft has 2 types of energy: kinetic energy, which is speed; potential energy, which is altitude. You can trade one for the other. Dive to gain speed, climb to gain altitude. The trick is managing your energy state to always have more total energy than your opponent. The Zero excelled at low-energy fighting, slow speeds, tight turns, close-range snapshots. That is where Japanese training and aircraft design dominated. But the P-38 excelled at high-energy fighting, fast speeds, vertical maneuvers, long-range gunnery. The P-38 had more powerful engines. It could climb faster above 15,000 feet. It could accelerate faster in level flight above 300 miles per hour. It could dive much faster. Lanphier proposed a tactic, boom and zoom, but modified for the Zero's specific characteristics. Start every fight with an altitude advantage, 3,000 feet minimum. When you spot Zeros below, do not turn toward them. Dive straight down, building speed to 400 miles per hour or more. Make one firing pass. Do not try to maneuver for a perfect shot. Just get your nose pointed close enough to the target. Fire a 2-second burst. Keep diving. Pull out below the enemy. Use your speed to extend away horizontally. Then convert that speed into a climb back to altitude. If the Zero follows your dive, he has to pull out early. You will be below him, accelerating away, and he cannot catch you. If he does not follow, you climb back up, and you are ready for another diving attack. Never turn. Never fight slow. Never let the fight become a dogfight. Keep it fast. Keep it vertical. Use your energy advantage to control when you attack and when you leave. The Zero can only kill you if you let it get into a turning fight. 5th Air Force tested the tactic in squadron training exercises during December 1942. P-38 pilots practiced diving attacks against each other, learning to judge closure rates at 400 miles per hour, learning to fire accurate bursts during high-speed dives, learning to pull out without overstressing the airframe. The maneuver was brutal on pilot bodies. Pull too hard coming out of a 400 miles per hour dive, and you would generate 7 or 8 Gs. Most pilots blacked out at 6 Gs, so they practiced 5 G pullouts, which meant starting the pullout earlier, which meant losing less altitude, which meant better energy retention. Landfear called it energy fighting. Kenny called it boom and zoom Pacific style. The pilots called it the Barber pole because Rex Barber had been the first one to actually use it in combat and survive. On January 15, 1943, 5th Air Force issued new tactical guidance to all P-38 squadrons. Engage Japanese fighters only with altitude advantage. Maintain speeds above 350 miles per hour in combat. Use diving attacks exclusively. Do not attempt long-turning fights under any circumstances. Pilots who violated these guidelines would be removed from combat status. It was the most clear order to avoid dogfighting ever issued by American military command. It felt like cowardice written into doctrine. Fighter pilots were not supposed to run, but the statistics did not lie. P-38s fighting Zeros in turning fights lost at 1.5 to 1. P-38s would lose the air war. Japan would maintain air superiority over the Solomons. The campaign would fail. So the doctrine changed, and pilots like Rex Barber learned to fight like high desert ranchers instead of like medieval knights. The new tactics worked immediately. January 19, 1943. 12 P-38s from the 339th Fighter Squadron encountered 18 Zeros over New Georgia. Traditional fight, the Zeros would have turned into the Americans. Forced a dogfight, killed 4 or 5 P-38s while losing maybe 2 Zeros. Instead, the P-38s stayed at altitude, dove on pairs of Zeros, made firing passes at 410 miles per hour, extended away, climbed back to altitude. The combat lasted 11 minutes. 5 Zeros destroyed, 0 P-38 losses. The Japanese pilots could not understand what had happened. The Americans refused to dogfight. The Americans just dove, shot, and ran away over and over. Untouchable, impossible to counter. The hidden advantage was not better maneuverability. It was not better armament. It was not better pilot training. The hidden advantage was speed, specifically dive speed. The P-38's structural strength and engine power gave it a dive speed range that the Zero could not match. In any other type of fighting, dogfighting, turning, slow-speed combat, the Zero was superior. But in the vertical, in high-speed diving attacks, the P-38 dominated absolutely. And once American pilots learned to keep every fight in that type of fighting, the Zero's advantages became irrelevant. Japanese commanders noticed the change in American tactics. By February, intelligence reports from Zero pilots described P-38s that would not fight. Americans who attacked once and ran away. Cowardly behavior, they called it, but the loss rates told a different story. January Japanese fighter squadrons in the Solomons reported shooting down 27 P-38s. February, they reported shooting down 9 P-38s. March, they reported shooting down 4 P-38s. Meanwhile, P-38 squadrons claimed 73 kills in March. The ratio had flipped from 1.5 to 1 in Japan's favor to 18 to 1 in America's favor. The P-38 squadrons improved the tactic over the following months. They learned that the ideal attack started from 5,000 feet above the target. Lower than that, and you could not build enough speed advantage. Higher than that, and you lost too much time in the dive. The closure rate was too high. They learned that firing should begin at 400 yards and stop at 200 yards. Closer than 200 yards meant risk of collision or debris strike. They learned that pullout should start at 2,000 feet above the target's altitude. That gave enough margin to avoid over-G while maintaining speed for the extension. They learned that the best armament was 4 50 caliber machine guns loaded with armor-piercing incendiary rounds and one 20mm cannon loaded with high explosive shells. The 50 calibers would start the damage. The 20mm would finish it. Zeros were lightly built. They had no armor plating, no self-sealing fuel tanks. 350 caliber rounds through the engine would cause critical damage. 120mm shell in the fuel tank would cause an explosion. They learned that you did not need to kill the Zero on the first pass. Damage was enough. A damaged Zero with a wounded pilot could not dogfight effectively. It had to return to base. That removed it from combat just as effectively as destruction, and a damaged Zero trying to limp home was vulnerable to follow-up attacks from the same P-38, making another diving pass 20 seconds later. The tactics spread beyond 5th Air Force. 13th Air Force adopted them in March. Navy squadrons in the Pacific asked for briefings on P-38 energy fighting tactics to apply to F-6F Hellcat operations. The Marines used similar principles with F-4U Corsairs. By April 1943, every American fighter pilot in the Pacific theater knew the core principle. Do not dogfight Japanese fighters. Stay fast, stay high, attack from above, extend away. Repeat, which brings us back to April 18, 1943. Operation Vengeance, the mission to intercept Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville. Yamamoto had planned the Pearl Harbor attack. He commanded the Japanese combined fleet. He was the strategic architect of Japan's Pacific naval campaign. American intelligence had decoded his travel schedule. He would be flying from Rabaul to Balalai airfield in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber escorted by 6 Zeros. 18 P-38s launched from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. 435 miles one way. Maximum range for the P-38 even with drop tanks. They flew at wave-top altitude to avoid radar detection. At 9:34 hours, they spotted 2 G4M bombers and 6 Zeros at 4,500 feet, exactly where intelligence predicted. The P-38 split into 2 groups, killer flight, 4 aircraft led by Captain Lanfear, and including Lieutenant Barber, would intercept the bombers. Cover flight, 14 aircraft, would engage the Zeros. The cover flight climbed to 18,000 feet. The Zeros saw them and turned to intercept. Classic Zero tactics. Force a turning fight, use superior maneuverability to win. But the P-38s did not turn. They dove. 14 P-38s in near vertical dives from 18,000 feet, accelerating past 400 miles per hour. The Zeros tried to follow. They could not. At 350 miles per hour, the Zero pilots had to pull out or lose control. The P-38s blew past them, extended away, climbed back to altitude on the other side of the formation. The Zeros were out of position. The bomber escort had been neutralized without firing a shot. Energy fighting at its purest application. Meanwhile, Lanfear and Barber dove on the bombers. The G4Ms were at 4,500 feet, accelerating, trying to reach the jungle where they could hide in ground clutter. Barber lined up on the second bomber, 400-yard range. He triggered his guns. The 50 caliber rounds walked up the fuselage. The 20mm shells hit the right engine. The engine exploded. The bomber's right wing folded up. The aircraft rolled inverted and crashed into the jungle. Yamamoto was in that bomber, the most important strategic target of the Pacific Air War. Killed by a diving attack that Japanese pilots considered cowardly. Lanfear hit the first bomber. Same tactics. Diving attack at 400 miles per hour, 2-second burst, massive damage. That bomber crashed into the ocean 3 miles from shore. Both bombers destroyed. All 6 escorting Zeros survived but failed to protect their charges. They had been outmaneuvered by P-38s that refused to maneuver. They had been beaten by a hidden advantage they had not understood existed. The Americans had found a way to fight that made the Zero's greatest strength, its turning ability, completely irrelevant. The impact of Yamamoto's death on Japanese strategy was deep. The combined fleet lost its most skilled commander. Japanese naval operations became more cautious, less innovative, but the tactical impact of energy fighting was equally significant. By May 1943, Japanese air superiority over the Solomons had collapsed. American fighters controlled the skies. Bomber raids hit Japanese positions without effective fighter opposition. The campaign that had been bleeding the United States of aircraft and pilots turned into a grinding Japanese defeat. 5th Air Force statistics for May 1943 showed the change. P-38 squadrons flew 3,218 combat sorties. They reported 201 fights with Japanese fighters. They claimed 147 enemy aircraft destroyed. They lost 9 P-38s in air-to-air combat, a ratio of 16-1. The P-38, which had been losing to Zeros in January, was now dominating them completely. Same aircraft, same pilots mostly, different tactics. The kill-to-loss ratio kept improving. June 21-1, July 24-1. By August 1943, Japanese fighter squadrons in the Solomon Islands were refusing to engage P-38s unless they had overwhelming numerical superiority. Even then, they would break off if the P-38s kept altitude advantage. The psychological advantage had flipped completely. Zero pilots who had felt invincible in early 1942 now felt hunted. The P-38 became the dominant American fighter in the Pacific theater. It served through the end of the war. Total P-38 production, 10,037 aircraft. Total Pacific theater kills claimed by P-38 pilots, 1,800. The leading American ace of all time was Major Richard Bong, who flew P-38s. 40 confirmed victories, all in the Pacific, all using energy fighting tactics. He never dogfought. He always dove, shot, extended, and climbed. He died in August 1945 testing a P-80 jet fighter in California. He was 24 years old. Rex Barber survived the war. He completed 104 combat missions. He was credited with 5 confirmed victories. After Yamamoto's death, he never spoke publicly about the mission for 30 years. The operation remained classified until 1973 when historians finally interviewed him. He downplayed his role. "I was just doing what we had trained to do," he said. "Dive fast, shoot straight, do not turn with Zeros. That is what kept us alive." He left the Air Force in 1946, returned to Oregon, managed a hardware store in Culver for 38 years. He died on July 26, 2001, age 80. The town named a park after him. The Air Force named a building at Luke Air Force Base after him. But his real legacy was tactical. He had helped prove that worse maneuverability does not mean defeat if you can find a different advantage and build your tactics around it. Thomas Lanphier retired as a colonel. He wrote extensively about fighter tactics in the 1950s. He argued that World War II had proven maneuverability was overrated in fighter design. Speed and energy management mattered more. The Air Force did not listen. They kept building maneuverable fighters through the 1960s. Then Vietnam happened. American fighters with poor energy management got into turning fights with nimble MiG-17s and MiG-21s. Loss rates spiked. The Air Force rediscovered energy fighting, relearned the lessons Lanphier had taught in 1943, and redesigned fighter tactics around speed and vertical maneuvers. The F-15 and F-16 were designed specifically as energy fighters. Both aircraft dominated in combat because they did what the P-38 had done. They refused to fight in types of fighting where the enemy was superior. The Zero's hidden weakness was the same as its greatest strength. Mitsubishi had optimized everything for turning performance. Lightweight, low wing loading, minimal armor. That made it unbeatable in dogfights but fragile in high-speed situations. The P-38's hidden advantage was the opposite. Lockheed had built a heavy, powerful, fast fighter that could not turn well but could dive like nothing else. For 2 years, American pilots tried to force the P-38 to be something it was not. Once they accepted what it actually was and fought accordingly, they won. Engineering schools still teach the P-38 versus Zero fight as a case study, not in aircraft design, but in tactical adaptation. The aircraft did not change. The tactics changed, and that made all the difference. So what did you think about how the P-38 overcame its apparent disadvantages? Did this change how you see the importance of tactics versus raw performance? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like. It helps more history enthusiasts discover these tactical innovations from World War II. Every like tells YouTube to share this with people who appreciate military history. And do not forget to subscribe so you never miss another deep dive into the battles and innovations that shaped the war. There are so many more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories about pilots who won by refusing to fight fair. Stories about engineers who built aircraft that seemed wrong until someone figured out how to use them right. Real people, real innovation, real history that matters. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Are you in California, Australia, Japan? Our community spans the entire world. Tell us your location. Tell us if you have family who flew fighters in the Pacific. Just let us know you are here. Thanks for watching, and thanks for keeping these stories alive.